Mr. Lowell? The young man asked. It was an April morning on a cool but sunny day in 1960. The young man had started out from New Braunfels at 7:30. He got lost a couple of times, and it had taken him an hour and a half to find the ranch and this man. When he didn't get a response for the elderly man, he asked, "You are Mr. Clint Lowell, aren't you?" "Who wants to know?" the old man asked as he stood up. "And why is it any of your business?" The old man had been sitting in a rocking chair on the porch of a modest home. The house sat on just over 2 acres in the Hill County outside of New Braunfels, Texas. It had once been in the middle of a good-sized cattle ranch, but most of the land had been sold off over the years. "I'm Sam Rayburn, Mr. Lowell," the young man answered. "I work for National Geographic magazine." "National what?" "Oh yeah, that's the magazine with the pictures of the natives with no clothes on." The old man laughed hard and then coughed for several seconds. "Seen them pictures a time or two. We do print pictures of other things, sir. You know, landscapes, cities, vegetation, and—" "Never paid attention to anything but those naked natives," Lowell interrupted the young man. "You told me who you are, but why are you here, boy?" Sam looked at Clint Lowell and could picture the young man he had been. Even at his advanced age, Clint stood straight and tall. He's about 6 feet and 180 pounds, Sam thought. Lowell's hair was mostly white, but still had a few streaks of dark brown running through it, but the walrus-type mustache was pure white. "Those blue eyes could likely bore holes in you if you got angry," Sam observed. "I'm doing a story about range wars and feuds in the Old West, sir," Sam replied. "Mostly in the middle to late 1800s. One of the range wars I've done research on is the Pleasant Valley War in Arizona. I know you were involved and hoped you would tell me about it." "Not much to tell, Sonny. I was only involved, as you say, for about a week. But Mr. Lowell, you were actually there. As far as I can tell, you're the only living person who was involved in any of those wars and feuds. It would be exciting to hear the story firsthand." Clint didn't reply and stared off at the hills in the distance. Sam had the good sense not to push the old man. He knew from talking to people in New Braunfels that he'd have to go slow or Lowell would tell him, "Get the hell off my property." After several minutes of silence, Clint came back from wherever he had been in his mind. He smiled at Sam and said, "This is God's own backyard, boy." Clint swept his arm around at the rolling landscape. "Not good for raising much-sized cattle and kids, but it suits me." Sam really looked around at the countryside for the first time. Searching for the Lowell place, he hadn't really paid attention to the scenery. He saw a country of rolling hills mostly covered in cedars and junipers with grassy valleys in between. From where he sat, he could see a lake in the distance. Sam understood Clint's reference to it being God's backyard. "It almost took your breath away." "Yes, sir, I can see what you mean. It's real pretty country," Sam said. It never hurts to compliment a man's home, he thought. Although he was sincere in his appraisal of the area. "Will you talk with me, Mr. Lowell? I mean about the Pleasant Valley War?" Clint stared at the young man for several seconds. He can't be more than 25, maybe 30, Clint thought. No, he's educated cause he's a writer, but he looks like a cowboy that got dressed up in his Sunday go-to-meeting clothes. I knowed many an Indian who would have thought his reddish blonde hair would make a fine scalp. Boys got spunk to come out and brace me. "Come on up and have a seat," Clint suggested. "Reckon I don't have anything else to do right now. Might as well spend it talking with your son." Sam quickly stepped onto the porch and sat in the second rocking chair. Reaching down beside his rocker, Clint picked up a bottle of Jack Daniels and 2 half-pint mason jars. "Care for a taste?" he asked Sam. "Gonna have a touch myself. Talkin' makes me thirsty." Before Sam could answer, Clint poured 3 fingers of whiskey into a jar and handed it to him. He then filled the other mason jar to almost overflowing. "I don't normally drink this early in the day, Mr. Lowell," Sam finally got out after taking a sip. "You some kind of preacher or do-gooder, boy?" Clint took a big drink, sighed, and said, "Okay, now I can start my tale." Settling back in his chair, Clint rocked back and forth for a minute waiting for Sam to take a real drink. When he did, Clint started his story. "I reckon it was gonna happen no matter what we did," the old man began. "I mean, getting involved, as you said, in that damn feud. It was 86, I just turned 17 and—" "Excuse me, sir," Sam interrupted. "Would you mind telling me about yourself before that time? You know, sort of like a biography." "Well, what do you want to know? Where were you born, and when? How old are you?" "I was born in 1869. That makes me What year is it, Sonny?" "It's 1960, Mr. Lowell," Sam answered. "Well, that makes me, let's see. Damn, I'm 91 years old," Clint said in a surprised voice. "Never thought I'd live this long." He paused for a bit, chuckled and added, "At times I didn't think I'd make it to 30. Mr. Lowell, where were you born?" The records from back then are a little sketchy. Sam, putting a shirt and tie on a cow pony don't make him a mister. Clint will do just fine. I was born on a hard-scrapple little ranch just outside of Pleasant Valley, Arizona. I think they changed the name to Young some time ago. My ma was what is now called a single parent. My father left town when he found out she was going to have me. I thought my father had died until I was older, and ma told me the truth. I guess all those that called me a scumsucker later on were right. Clint laughed so hard he started coughing. After several seconds, he caught his breath and continued. Jolly Rollins was a drifter who stopped at the ranch to water his horses on his way south. Never did find out where he was headed or where he came from. It didn't make much difference because once he met my ma, he never left. Did find out his given name was Jared, but he hated to be called that. He and my ma raised me. Jolly treated me like I was his own. My ma and Jolly never got married. A piece of paper and some fancy words didn't matter to them. They loved each other something fierce. The old man got quiet for a bit. Don't really remember a lot about ma. She died of the fever when I was 10. What I remember most was she always smelled of fresh baked bread and apple butter, and she always had the time to give me a hug and a kiss. After she passed, it was just me and Jolly trying to make a living on the damned ranch. His real name was Jared Rollins, but everyone called him Jolly because he was always smiling, Logan, and playing jokes on you. He never laughed and seldom smiled after ma passed. The joy went out of him. Jolly almost went crazy from grief when ma died. I was digging her grave when he came back to himself. He hadn't been able to look at ma, and it was left up to me to get her ready to be buried. Clint got quiet and stared away at the hills. Hell of a thing for a 10-year-old boy to have to do, but I got it done. He sort of shook himself and continued. Jolly took over the digging when I went to see ma. I wrapped her in one of the quilts she'd made, and we put her in the ground. For 2 days, Jolly sat on our front stoop and stared at her grave. I took care of the stock and fed myself. Finally, Jolly stood and went to work. Clint had been looking out over the valley below his home as he talked. He turned to Sam and said, "You know, the Pleasant Valley area is about as pretty as a picture. It's just below the Mogollon Rim and has mountains, high country pastures, and valleys with grasslands and lots of water. Our little ranch had one of the best springs in the area. It never went dry and had a good output of cool, clear, sweet water. It was called Sweetwater Spring because the water tasted so good." Jolly never said what he'd done before he came to our ranch, but from the way he taught me how to handle a pistol, I'd say he'd been a gunfighter. He showed me how to shoot accurately, and then he taught me to pick my target, draw, and shoot real quick like. By the time I was 17, I was a better than average hand with a pistol. Jolly also taught me how to shoot a rifle. For the next 7 years we did okay, getting by and even put a little money aside. But sure as the world, if we got to living too good, something would knock us right back down. We'd start to build our herd, and some of the cattle would get killed by cougars, or wolves, or just plain disappear. Rustlers, I expect. Our barn burned down twice. No reason that I could see, but it did. But we hung on. We never went hungry, and we had a nice cabin to shelter us. I guess I'd still be there to this day if that damn feud hadn't started. How did it start, sir? Clint? It was mostly about property lines, water, and grazing rights. At least that's what the two sides claimed. The cattlemen just plain hated the sheepmen, and the sheep herders didn't like the cattlemen any better. There'd have been trouble anyway. The big he-bull who backed the sheepmen had been a cattle rancher himself, and now those two families hated each other. If they hadn't fought about cattle and sheep, it would have been something else. Clint took another drink. Reckon you studied about other feuds and such, haven't you, Sam? The younger man nodded. Reckon you looked at the Earp's Vendetta ride in '82. Yes, sir. Clint, Sam answered. When Morgan Earp was killed in March of '82, Wyatt and his brother Warren went on what now is called the Earp Vendetta ride, killing the men that had a hand in shooting Morgan. Doc Holliday, Turkey Creek Johnson, Sherman McMasters, and Texas Jack Vermillion made up the rest of their posse. I heard the story while I was still in Pleasant Valley. Don't pay to mess with a man's family, Clint said. Guess you read about the Lincoln County War over to New Mexico in '76. That's the one where Billy the Kid was involved. Yes, sir. Young Sam just couldn't help addressing the older man as sir. It was part of his upbringing. Clint smiled and nodded his head. You heard about the Sutton-Taylor feud down in Texas right after the Civil War too? Sam nodded. Clint went on. There have been a passel of others over the years, but none were as bloody and costly as the Pleasant Valley War. The last cattleman was killed in Tempe, Arizona in 1902. He was killed by the last of the sheepmen. That damn feud destroyed both families. The old man got quiet again for almost a minute. I wished they'd stayed fighting each other and left us alone. Now it was Sam's turn to stare out over the hills and the valley in front of the house. Would you tell me what happened, Clint? Jolly and me were bringing about a dozen cattle back to the pasture closest to our cabin and were jumped by 3 men. We fired back at them and ran them off. No one was shot, so we never thought too much about it. Thought they were rustlers. But the next morning, the same 3 came back to our cabin. Pretty bold for rustlers, Sam commented. Clint nodded. Yep, it would have been bold for rustlers. Jolly was sitting in front of the cabin, repairing a saddle when they rode up. They said they worked for the big cattle rancher in the area and they were going to take over our spring. Not so much because they needed the water, but to keep the sheep herders from using it, they said. Jolly told them over his dead body, and the 3 pulled their pistols. He stopped, looking up as if trying to remember something. Could have been the other way around. Could have been the sheep men wanting to keep the cattle ranchers from using our spring. It was a lot years ago, and I don't rightly remember. Don't make no difference, the result was the same. Where were you, Clint? I'd been out hunting that morning and came up behind them as they pulled their guns. One of the cowboys saw me and said something to the ramrod. I don't think they expected me, and as they turned to look at me, Jolly pulled his own pistol. They yelled and started shooting at him. I fired my scattergun at one of them but didn't kill him. He rode off holding his shoulder and leaning forward in his saddle. Found his body about a mile toward town the next day. Buried him on the spot. Jolly killed the other 2, but he was hit during the fight. Clint stopped talking, remembering back to the day that changed his life. I ran to see how bad hurt Jolly was, Clint continued. He'd been hit in his shoulder and his leg, but the one that killed him was in his stomach. Jolly said he was gut shot and wouldn't make it until morning. He told me to drag the dead men away from the cabin. Said he didn't want his last view of the ranch to be those 2 scumsuckers laying there. Couldn't you get a doctor for him? Sam asked. I was going to, but Jolly said a doc couldn't do anything for a gut shot man. He asked me to dig his grave next to Ma's after I drugged the bodies away. And you were 17 at the time, Sam offered. Hell of a thing for a teenager to have to do. Never thought about it that way, Clint replied. It was just something that had to be done. After a few seconds, the old man said, Anyway, I sat with Jolly until he died. He told me where he kept the money and told me I'd probably have to leave. Can't stand up to both sides by yourself, he said. He died late that evening. What about the law? Couldn't the sheriff or marshal protect you? Nope. The sheriff was with the cattlemen and the marshal was on the sheepmen's side. Either way, I wasn't gonna get any help from the law. What did you do? The sheriff and 2 men came out to the cabin the next morning looking for me. I hid my horses in a holler and hunkered down in a cave in the hill behind the cabin. They looked around, saw the new grave, and rode off. Later that morning, the marshal and 2 deputies came looking for me. That's when I decided to light out. I couldn't stand up to both sides. Sam was torn. He needed to get back to town and call his editor to let him know he'd found Clint and was talking to him, but he didn't want to leave. Right now, the old man was in a talkative mood, but he might not be tomorrow. Finally, he had to make a decision. Sir, I have to go call my boss and let him know I met you. May I come back tomorrow and talk with you some more? Clint stared at the young man for a minute or so. He liked this youngster. The boy was polite, had a bit of Texas twang in his voice, and seemed to really have a feel for his work. Where are you from, boy? I live in Los Angeles right now, but I was born not too far from here in Tarpley. How'd a Texan like you end up in Los Angeles? I went to the University of Texas and got a degree in journalism. That's how I ended up working for National Geographic. Sam smiled and added, I had a job offer from a couple of newspapers, but I would have been sitting at a desk most of the time. This job lets me spend more time outside. Tell you what, Texas Longhorn, Clint said with a smile. Use my phone to call your boss and I'll provide lunch for you, and we can talk some more. Suit you? Yes, sir, Sam replied. After he finished his phone call, the youngster joined Clint in the kitchen. There was a steaming pot of beef stew and fresh-baked biscuits sitting on the table. Hope you like beef stew, son, Clint said as he ladled the stew into 2 big bowls. Sit down and dig in. After eating, Sam helped clean up and Clint led him back to the rocking chairs on the front porch. No need to waste a pretty day sitting inside, he said. Back in his rocker, he poured whiskey into the mason jars and handed Sam his. Now where was I? Oh yeah. I left our ranch with 2 good horses and Jolly's guns, Clint continued his story. There was a Remington 1875.44-40 caliber handgun and a Winchester repeating rifle in the same caliber. Those items and 5 double Eagle $20 gold pieces were all I had to show for our ranch. More than I could expect if I stayed around. A smile came across Clint's face. I rode southeast for 9 or 10 days, and the first place I lit was Deming, New Mexico. It was a railroad town, a little rough around the edges that had ideas of becoming a big city. Dangerous Dan Tucker was the deputy marshal for that region and kept the peace in Deming. I've read about Marshal Tucker, Sam said. Some say he was the most underrated pistolero of the Old West. Don't know about that, but he sure didn't put up with any foolishness in Deming. Anyway, I tied up at the rail in front of the general store and saw a woman being pushed around by a short, pudgy man. He was yelling that she cheated him, and she was yelling right back at him. The man hauled off and backhanded the woman, knocking her off her feet. Clint paused and asked, "Why do men do that? I mean, hit a woman. Way I was raised, you just didn't do that." Taking another drink, Clint continued, "I couldn't abide a man beaten on a woman, so I stepped over to him, tapped him on the shoulder, and when he turned around, I backhanded him. Hurts, don't I?" said as he looked up at me from his back. He started to reach for his gun. I pulled my pistol and told him to go ahead if he wanted to meet his maker. "That's about enough, boys," Marshal Tucker told us. "Don't want no gunplay on Main Street, you know." I put my gun back in my holster. Didn't want no trouble with Dangerous Dan Tucker. "No siree. Bob, you head on home before you get into trouble. If you had been at home with your wife, you wouldn't have to worry about a lady cheating you," Marshal Tucker ordered the man on the ground. Bob got to his feet and quickly walked away. "You all right, Miss Lorena?" the marshal asked, turning to help the woman to her feet and helped gather her packages. "Am now, thanks to this young gentleman." Bob was about to get real nasty. "What are you doing in my town?" the marshal asked me. "Just passing through. Thought I'd pick up some supplies, camp outside of town, and be on my way in the morning." "Not staying in town tonight?" Miss Lorena asked. I hemmed and hawed and admitted I didn't want to spend the money for a hotel room or boarding house. "I don't mind sleeping on the ground. Been doing it for 10 days or so." "Well, Miss Lorena started. "Sorry, I'm Clint Lowell, ma'am," I replied, tipping my hat. "Well, Mr. Lowell, I'm Lorena Dunstan. I run a fancy house and would be pleased to offer you a room, lunch, and supper if you've a mind to. It's the least I can do for your help." "A fancy house, ma'am?" I asked. I was a young boy who'd never been to a big town before and didn't know what Miss Lorena was talking about. "A brothel," she answered. Seeing that I still didn't understand, she smiled and added, "A bordello, Mr. Lowell." I was still confused, and the marshal whispered in my ear, "A 304 house, son?" "Oh," I said, getting red in the face. I studied her for several seconds. Lorena Dunstan was a fine-looking woman. I couldn't tell by the way she dressed that she was the madam of a bordello. That's a term I learned later. She looked like a well-dressed schoolmarm or a banker's wife or something. I figured Miss Lorena was 35 to 40, about the same age as my ma would have been. I found out later she was closer to 50 than to 40. She was tall for a woman, with long black hair and big brown eyes. Like I said, she was dressed like a lady, but she sure filled out her dress in all the right places. Miss Lorena saw that I finally understood what type of house she owned. She told me, "Understand, Mr. Lowell, all I'm offering is a clean room to sleep in and a couple of meals." "Yes, Em. Thank you. I accept. Don't mind sleeping on the ground, but I'm getting right tired of trail food." I tied the lead rope of my pack horse to my saddle horn, and leading my saddle bronc, I walked with Miss Lorena to her fancy house. She handed me the packages she'd carried out of the mercantile with as if I were a gentleman escorting her home. In a way, I guess I was. On the way to her house, Miss Lorena talked about her business and her girls. She wasn't embarrassed or apologetic about how she made a living. I provide a service for the railroad men, travelers, and some of the locals. They can come and have a little fun with a nice girl in my house, and they know they won't be beaten or robbed. In return, I'm well paid for providing that service. Some of the ladies of the house were in the kitchen when Miss Lorena and I came in. The three young ladies sitting at the table sort of perked up when I walked into the room. Clint stopped his story to refill his mason jar and offered Sam the bottle. Sam didn't really want another drink, but poured some whiskey into his own jar. The old man nodded his approval. Those soiled doves, as they were called, were very interested in me. I was younger than most of their clients, clean cut, and I wasn't bad looking either. Clint laughed until he had another coughing fit. "You have to understand, Sam, that I wasn't always the beat-up, broken-down, old cowboy that I am now." Sam nodded, and Clint said, "I was just over 6 foot, tall for a man at that time. I had a full head of wavy brown hair, and I hadn't grown this yet." Clint stopped, stroking his full bushy mustache. Anyway, the ladies seemed real interested in me. "Howdy," one of the ladies said as she walked toward me. She had on a peignoir, another term I learned later, and not much else. The other two was dressed about the same way. Not to be outdone, they came toward me too. "I'm Maybelle," the first girl said. She took my hand as if to shake it, but pulled it to her body. "And who are you?" "Back off, girls," Miss Lorena said. She could have kept quiet as far as I was concerned. I was enjoying my hand on the girl's body. "This is Mr. Lowell, and he's just here for a couple of meals and a place to sleep for tonight. He's not a customer. Understand?" The girls nodded and went back to the table. Miss Lorena explained how we had met and her offer to put me up for the night. I thought the girls seemed to be disappointed. Don't know if it was because I wasn't going to spend any money or if it was because they wanted a tumble with a younger man. Miss Lorena's cook, a big woman named Josie, fixed lunch for me. As I ate, I looked around the kitchen, mostly to keep from staring at the pretty women sitting at the table. I had noticed that the house had at one time been really something, but it needed some work. There were a couple of the kitchen cabinet doors hung open, the back screen door drooped, and the water pump at the sink shifted back and forth as you tried to pump water. "After you've finished eating, you can put your horses in the barn," Miss Lorena told me. "There's your room," she said, pointing to a door down a hall leading from the kitchen. "I've got some book work to do, and I'll see you later. If you need anything, ask Josie." "Yes, ma'am." It was the best lunch I'd had in a long time. In fact, it was the first lunch I'd had since I left Pleasant Valley. Normally on the trail, I only ate 2 meals a day. "Miss Josie, that was a right fine meal." "Thank you," I said. When she turned toward me, I asked, "Are there any tools and such around here? Thought I might try fixing those cabinets and the screen door. No need to sit around doing nothing, and it's too early for sleeping." "There's a box with saws and such in the barn, Mr. Lowell," she replied, Logan at him for calling her Miss Josie. "Thank ye." I took my horses to the barn, watered and fed them, and turned them into a couple of stalls. Picking up the toolbox, I went back to the house and worked on the things I'd mentioned. I fixed a few other things before Josie rang the supper bell. It was early evening, about 4. The girls need to eat early, so they'd be available for clients later on. Miss Lorena invited me into the dining room and pointed to a chair next to her. There were 6 girls already seated at the table. This time they were dressed for the evening in dresses with short skirts and low necklines. The skimpy dresses were their working clothes. That was something else I learned later. After supper, Miss Lorena invited me to join them in the parlor where the girls would sit around waiting for clients. She had hired a piano player to entertain guests while they waited for their chosen lady. A well-stocked bar was also available. Handing Clint a glass half filled with whiskey, Miss Lorena sat next to him. "Understand you did a lot of repair work on the house today." "Thank you." "You're welcome. Wasn't much, but I don't like just sitting around waiting for bedtime. Thought I'd make myself useful while I'm here. That's something I'd like to talk to you about, Mr. Lowell." Miss Lorena took a sip of her wine and looked at Clint for several seconds. "I'd like to offer you a job, Mr. Lowell." Clint was surprised. "I don't know nothing about this type of business, ma'am. Don't know of what use I could be." "I know about my business, Mr. Lowell. That's all that's needed. I want you to be a sort of maintenance man. You can fix things that need fixing, like you fixed the pump in the kitchen. Anything you can't do, you can hire someone to do. Basically, you'd be the house manager." Thinking about staying in one place instead of roving around appealed to Clint. "I reckon I could do that, ma'am. In addition, I'd want you to sit here in the parlor during our busy times. We don't have much trouble here. I won't allow it. But once in a while, a client will act up. He might not like having to wait for the girl of his choice, or he might have too much to drink, or he might refuse to pay for the services. If that happens, I expect you to handle the man and resolve the situation." "Reckon I can handle that too," he replied. "I will pay you $70 a month. You can sleep in the room you'll be using tonight, and I'll provide your meals." "Will that satisfactory, Mr. Lowell?" Clint was surprised at the wages mentioned. Except for the money Jolly had put aside, $70 was more cash money than he's seen in 5 years. "Miss Dunstan, you just hired yourself a hand. Miss Lorena will do fine, Mr. Lowell. I'm glad you accepted my offer. You can start work this evening." She looked him over for a minute and said, "Go to the barber, have your hair cut, and take a bath. Then go to the general mercantile and get some better clothes. If you're going to sit in the parlor, you must look respectable. Here's $5 for the barber, and tell Mr. Mitchell at the store to put the clothes on my account. I'll expect you back in the parlor in 2 hours, Mr. Lowell, if you please." "Yes, ma'am," Clint said. He went to the barn, got his horse, and rode into town. Sure don't want to keep Miss Lorena waiting, he thought. Sam couldn't help but smile at the happy look on Clint's face as he told his story. "That job must have been a wonderful thing for a young boy from the back country," he observed. "It was one of the best parts of my life, let me tell you," Clint replied with a grin. Still grinning, he continued. "About a month after I took the job, the girls found out I'd never been with a woman. I sure didn't tell them, but they found out. Every one of those 6 ladies decided she was just the one to teach me the ways of the world." Clint seemed pleased at the memory. "There was hardly a night that I didn't have company in my bed. I slept alone sometimes when a cattle drive came through town, or on a really busy night, but that didn't happen very often. I'd been at the house for about 2 months, Clint said, continuing his story, before Miss Lorena mentioned what the girls and me was doing. One morning she came out to the barn where I was mucking out horse stalls. She stood and watched me for a couple of minutes. When I saw her, I stopped working. "Something I can do for you, Miss Lorena?" "I understand my girls have been adding to your education, Mr. Lowell," she answered. "Huh?" I asked. She smiled and said, "One or the other of the girls have been warming your bed most evenings." I got all red-faced and finally stammered, "Yes, Em. I didn't know it was a problem." "No problem, Mr. Lowell. What the girls do on their own time is up to them." Miss Lorena paused for a few seconds and then said, "I know a young man's first time can be, let's say, emotional, but I warn you, don't get too fond of any one of the ladies." "I don't understand, ma'am." "Don't fall in love with one of my ladies," she explained. "They're working girls and it's their job, and most times they're pleased to make a man feel special and loved. But don't get caught up with that. You'll just end up hurt and angry." It was sort of strange that she would say something to me. Or maybe she knew, but I'd started to get feelings for one of the ladies. Molly Dawson was her name. At 19, she was the youngest of the girls, and I spent more time with her than any of the others. She was about 5 feet 4 inches and slender with red hair and bright green eyes. She had freckles across her nose and in other interesting places. Miss Lorena's warning came too late. I was already halfway in love with Molly. Don't know where it would have gone, because about 3 weeks after Miss Lorena talked to me, Molly left. Seems one of her regulars, a cowboy from a local ranch, was moving to California and asked Molly to marry him and go with him. She packed her things, kissed me goodbye, and left without a how do you do. I guess I was heartbroken. Miss Lorena spent extra time talking with me and spent one night in my room. I quickly got over Molly. I lived in that house for going on 4 years, and that was the only time she came to my room. The rest of the ladies did their part to see that I didn't feel too bad about Molly leaving. It wasn't any time at all before I hardly remembered Molly. Miss Lorena was never anything but Miss Lorena to me. Even after she comforted me about Molly, I called all the ladies by their given names, but she was always Miss Lorena. I was always Mr. Lowell to her. We never had much trouble with the clients, but when we did, it came in spades. The pudgy man who hit Miss Lorena the day I met her was one. Sometimes we get a cowboy or traveling salesman, or a railroad man who would get a little rowdy, but not often. One fall evening, the ladies were very busy. We had a cattle drive passing through. The railroad had 10 or so men at the hotel in town, and 4 of our town regulars was in our parlor. A grizzled cowboy started arguing with one of the railroaders about who was next with one of the girls. The cowboy pulled his pistol. "By God, we'll just see who goes next," he yelled in drunken anger. "Put it away, mister," I said, standing with my hand on my gun butt. He turned and raised his pistol toward me. I drew and fired real fast, just like Jolly had taught me. Lucky for the cowboy, I was able to pick my target and hit him in the shoulder. Marshall Tucker never came by the house to investigate. It wasn't the only time I had to use my gun, but it didn't happen very often. Mostly I could persuade the angry men to go outside. Sometimes I had to teach them some manners. "Sam, I lived in that house with Miss Lorena and the ladies for 4 years, Clint told the young reporter. "It wasn't always the same ladies, you know. They came and went as the wind blew them." "Did all of the ladies want to help out a young man?" Sam asked with a smile. "Pretty much. I think in 4 years there was only 4 or 5 of the ladies who didn't cotton to educating me." Clint grinned and added, "Not a bad average, son. Not a bad average at all. I guess I'd stayed forever, but..." The old man stopped and poured himself another drink. One morning, Miss Lorena didn't come down to breakfast. Miss Josie sent one of the ladies up to get her. We heard a scream and rushed upstairs. Miss Lorena was sorta propped up on her pillows. She looked real peaceful-like, but she'd passed away in her sleep. The older man looked out over the valley for a few minutes. Sam waited for him to continue. It was several minutes before Clint went on with his story. "We buried Miss Lorena 2 days later. You'd have been surprised at all the people who came to the burial service. Not many women, besides our ladies, but several important men from town. There was even a representative from the railroad." Clint smiled. "Reckon she cast a large shadow." Then he frowned. 2 days after we put Miss Lorena to rest, Marshall Tucker led a man to the house. He was pompous-looking, sort of fat, with a serious face and wore a collared shirt and tie. "Howdy, Clint, ladies," Marshall Tucker greeted me and tipped his hat to the girls sitting on the porch. "This here is Joe Dunstan." "That's Joseph Dunstan, if you please, Marshall," the dude said. "Miss Lorena's son," the marshal added. I heard the ladies gasp behind me, and I was darn near poleaxed myself. Miss Lorena had never talked about any kin, much less a son. "Well, howdy, Joseph. It's nice to meet you," I said, walking down the steps and sticking out my hand. Your ma didn't tell us about you. Dunstan ignored my hand. Now that I've seen the property, I've decided to sell it. I have a good offer from the railroad. I believe I'll accept it. But what about the ladies, Joseph? I asked. Where will they go? I hated to leave, but I'd been on the move when I came to Dimming. I could be on the move again. It's Mr. Dunstan, young man, and I couldn't care less about these 304s, he said with contempt. That's when I knocked him down. You son of a witch, I yelled at him. Marshall Tucker grabbed me and pulled me away from Dunstan. Settle down, Clint. Then he smiled and said real low, that's what they are after all. Maybe so, but that don't give the horses shit the right to talk to them like that, I replied. Marshall, arrest that man. He attacked me and you're a witness, Dunstan ordered. Mr. Dunstan, I decide who gets arrested around here. And all I saw was you tripping over your own feet. Turning back to me, the marshal said, reckon y'all better get ready to move on. Come on, Mr. Dunstan. You've done about all the damage you can do here. Ladies, he said, tipping his hat again. The marshal said Miss Lorena had left instructions with him 2 months ago for him to contact Joseph if anything happened to her. I'm sorry as hell to have to do this, but you'll have to get out by the end of the week. He looked each of us in the eye and added, I don't have a choice. Dunstan got the judge to issue an eviction notice. That gave us 5 days to figure out where to go. 4 of the ladies took the stage west to find a new town to work in. One of them went back east to a home she'd left several years ago. Lily said that with her savings and the donation by Joseph that she had saved enough to open a millinery shop and get out of the 304 business. Me? I saddled my horse, packed the panniers on my pack horse, and rode southeast again. I thought I'd give Texas a try. This time it was Sam that poured more whiskey into the mason jars. Clint smiled as the boy handed him the half-full jar. What donation by Dunstan, and why'd you pick Texas? Sam asked. I mean, you knew more about the New Mexico area. Clint had a big grin on his face that showed in his eyes too. Reckon I can tell you. What do you call it? Oh yeah. The statute of limitations has run out. Joseph swore out an arrest warrant on me, so I thought I'd better leave Marshall Tucker's jurisdiction. A warrant? On what grounds? Sam asked. Miss Lorena never trusted banks much. She kept most of her money in a strong box. One of my jobs was to guard that box. I kept it under my bed. Joseph knew about his ma's distrust of banks, but it seems that when he took over the house after we left, that strong box was lighter. I mean, the box was still there, sitting open on the kitchen table, but the money was gone. How much money and what happened to it? Sam was grinning too as he asked the question. Well, let's just say that the ladies, Miss Josie and the house manager, had a stake when they left. As I remember, it worked out to about $600 each. Clint chuckled and added, mostly in gold double eagles it was. I thought it best to leave Dimming in Luna County, New Mexico. A little over a year later, I rode into Pecos, Texas. Pecos was a railroad town on the Texas and Pacific line. A lot of cattle drives ended up at the railhead. I hadn't been anyplace special, just drifted around for a spell. Between the money I'd earned at Miss Lorena's and my share of what was in that strong box, I was pretty well set and didn't have to work. I stopped in Pecos for one night, figured I owed myself a soft bed, a good meal, and a visit to a saloon. The visit to the saloon was a bit longer than I intended. There was a few dance hall girls in the place, and they reminded me of the ladies at Miss Lorena's. The next day, I didn't get on my way until mid-morning. It was late afternoon when I realized I'd forgot to fill all 3 of my canteens. Guess the pounding headache I had when I woke up kept me from thinking straight. I saw a cabin and a barn not far off the trail and rode to it. Riding up to a well in front of the house, I sat on my horse until a man came out. Be obliged if I could fill my canteens, mister, I said. The man stared at me for almost a minute before he answered. It can be a fair piece between water holes. Step down and drink your fill, then fill your canteens. I'm Zebediah Thomas. Clint Lowell, Mr. Thomas, I replied as I dismounted. We talked as I filled my canteens and watered my horse. I found out that he was having problems with the cattlemen cutting his fences as they drove their herds toward Pecos. If I didn't have to fix fences all the time, we might make a better go of it. It's good land for growing things, but every time a herd comes, though, the cattle stomp my crops in the ground. I don't understand why they can't stick to the trail out there. Don't have time to do all that needs doing. Thomas stopped and gave me a small smile. Sorry, when I get started, I sometimes don't know when to stop. Where you headed, Mr. Lowell? Clint is good. Don't rightly know where I'm going. I was run off my ranch up to Pleasant Valley, Arizona 4 years ago and been drifting ever since. Cattlemen run me off, but I fin they hadn't the sheep men would have. They both wanted my water hole. If you've a mind, I can put you to work for a while, Zeb told me. I'll pay you $30 a month and found. Looking at my low-slung pistol belt, he added, "I'm hiring a farmhand, not a gunfighter, understand? I'd like the job, Zeb. Like to stay put for a bit. But just so you understand, if the cowboys push me, I'll push back." Zeb offered his hand. "Reckon we can work together. Come over to the house and get washed up for supper. You can sleep in the barn." He introduced his wife Lisa to me. "Sit down, Mr. Lowell. Supper is ready." For the next 2 weeks, I worked my tail off. Zeb hadn't been joking. There was too much work for one man. The first thing I learned was how to mend barbed wire fences. The rest of the work was pretty much what I'd done on our ranch. One morning, just after breakfast, Zeb stepped outside, stopped, and stared toward the south. "What wrong, Zeb?" I asked. "Hear that?" he asked, pointing to the south with his chin. I listened and nodded. "It's a herd heading for Pecos. Sounds like they're coming right for us." I went to the barn and saddled my horse. Strapping on my gun belt and putting my rifle in the saddle scabbard, I mounted. "Leavin', are you?" Zeb asked. "No, sir. I'll go say hello and ask them to drive the cattle around your place," I answered with a grim smile. I put the spurs to my horse and rode to the farm's boundary fence. I stopped my horse, pulled my rifle, and rested the butt on my hip. 2 scouts from the herd rode closer. "Howdy," I said. "Reckon y'all better go back and tell them drovers to change their direction." "What do mean, mister?" the biggest of the 2 asked. "You're not driving that herd across this farm." The men looked at me for almost a minute, then turned their horses and rode back to the herd. I lit a cigar and waited. Shortly, the 2 scouts and an older man rode back. "I'm Jeff Langer. This is my herd." "What do you mean I'm not going to cross this land? This is open range." "Not anymore, Mr. Langer. Zeb Thomas has settled this farm all legal-like. You'll have to find another way to Pecos." "And where do you suggest I take my herd, youngster?" "Take him east or take him west or take him to hell. I don't care. But you're not driving across this farm. And you're gonna stop us, all by yourself," Langer said, smiling. "Son, there's 3 of us here and another dozen back with the herd. Think you can stop all of us?" "No, sir, but if trouble starts, I'll shoot you first. At this range, I can't miss and would probably kill you," I replied, staring him in the eye. "After that, it won't make much difference to either one of us. Turn your cattle, Mr. Langer." The man on Langer's right said, "Ah, hell," and pulled his pistol. I dropped the barrel of my rifle and shot him out of his saddle. Like Jolly had taught me, I'd picked my target. The man slowly sat up on the ground, holding his shoulder. "Take your man and go, Mr. Langer, before someone gets killed," I ordered. I stayed at the property line for another hour until I could see the herd passing to the west of Zeb's farm. "Herd shootin'," Zeb said when I returned to the farmhouse. "Had to shoot a man to make him understand that they weren't gonna cross your land." I stayed with the Zeb and Lisa until early fall. The last herd of the season had come and gone. I'd had another discussion or 2 with cattlemen, but hadn't had to shoot anyone else. The word got passed to bypass the Thomas farm. "Time for me to move on, Zeb," I told him one evening after supper. "Been here long enough. You could stay, Clint. I'd make you a partner if you did," Zeb offered. "Obliged, but I'm not a farmer, and sitting in one place too long makes me edgy. I'll be moving on in the morning." "How old were you, Clint?" Sam asked. He was writing in a notebook as Clint told his story. "Reckon I was 23 or thereabout," he replied. "But as they say, I was old beyond my years." "Where'd you go after the Thomas farm? You stay in Texas?" "Yep. Thought about going back to Arizona, but figured I'd end up killing someone, or being killed. Them killing Jolly and forcing me off the ranch still didn't set well with me. Decided I'd better stay in Texas." "That's it? You decided you'd stay in Texas? That's not the whole story, though, is it?" Sam encouraged Clint to continue. "No, I guess not. I left the Thomas place and rode north by northeast for 4 or 5 days until I got to Odessa. Weren't in a hurry to get nowhere, you understand. So I didn't push hard and rode easy every day. Stayed there for a couple of months and then drifted on again. I rode south too." "Wait a minute, Clint. What happened while you were in Odessa?" Sam asked. "I've done some research and I know you ended up owning some land there. How'd that come about?" "Nosy little cuss, aren't you?" Clint said, grinning at the young writer. "Reckon you could say that," Sam replied, stressing his Texas twang. "What happened?" Clint chuckled at the boy's put-on accent. "Well, you see, I rode into Odessa and treated myself to the 3 things I usually did when I came onto a town. A soft bed, a good meal or 2, and a visit to a saloon. Wasn't a big drinker, but I did enjoy my whiskey after days or weeks on the trail. Stayed in Odessa for 3 or 4 days and decided it was time to move on. My money situation was still good. I still had most of the $600 that Joseph Dunstan had contributed to my travel and fund. and there was close to $2,000 saved for my job with Miss Lorena. There was no need of me looking for work just yet, so I decided to roam around until I found somewheres I wanted to light. I was putting the supplies I'd bought at the General Mercantile in my pack saddle when I saw a face I knowed. Walking down the wooden sidewalk was Miss Lily, one of Miss Lorena's ladies. She was the one that headed back to her home. Guess she didn't make it. Miss Lily looked up as she passed me and stopped. She got a big smile on her face. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. How are you, Clint? Just fine, Miss Lily. Thought you were going back east. She stepped closer and replied, I did go home, but my folks didn't want me there. You know cause of what I'd been, and so came back west. I'm sorry as hell it didn't work out for you, Miss Lily. I'm not. Coming to Odessa was the best thing that I could have done. Miss Lily was all smiles. I started that millinery shop like I wanted, and I met my husband. That's just fine, Miss Lily. I'm happy for you. I thought for several seconds. Don't reckon it'd be a good idea for me to meet him, I said with a grin. Miss Lily didn't return my grin. He was killed last month. Sorry, Miss Lily. How'd it happen? She explained to me that her husband, Rafe James, had supposedly put the ranch up to cover a bet in a poker game. He lost. Rafe claimed his coffee had been spiked and said he hadn't put the ranch into the poker pot. Royce Littleton was the man who won the poker game. He had witnesses that said Rafe called the bet and used the ranch as his stake. Littleton told Rafe and Miss Lily that he'd give them 1 month to come up with the money. If they didn't, he'd take over the ranch. Rafe had gone to the county sheriff 2 days later, demanding an investigation. They found his body about 2 miles from our place, Miss Lily said. They said he was drunk, fell off his horse, and broke his neck. She looked up at me. Clint, Rafe didn't drink. He couldn't. 1 taste of alcohol made him deathly sick, and Rafe never fell off a horse in his life. Her eyes were hard and intense as she went on. Littleton or his men killed Rafe, as sure as I'm standing here, and there ain't a thing I can do about it. How much do you owe? I asked. Miss Lily had been good to me, and I thought maybe I could help her. $2,000, and it might as well be the moon, she answered. I can't get hold of that kind of money. Where do I find this Royce Littleton? Maybe he'll feel sorry for a widow woman and give you more time, I suggested. Or maybe I can pay your loan for you. He'd have to give me a couple of years. I can't work the ranch, and with what I make from the shop it'd take 2 years or more to pay him back. And I can't ask you for the money. Besides, where would you get that much? Never you mind, Miss Lily. You took good care of me and taught me a lot at Miss Lorena's. At least I can talk to Littleton. Where can I find him? When she hesitated, I added, Don't look like you've got much choice. If you're gonna talk money, you need to see his lawyer, Justin Tyler. He's got an office over the bank down on the corner yonder. Y'all go on back to your shop, I told her. I'll go talk to this Tyler and see what can be done. Meet you in an hour or so. I rode to the bank, put my saddlebags over my shoulder, and climbed the outside staircase to Justin Tyler's office. Knocking on the door, I went in. There was a big man, big as in fat, sitting behind the desk. This man sure ain't missed many meals, I thought. He looked to be about 50 and had a double chin and fat pudgy fingers. Mr. Tyler? I asked, and he nodded. I'm a friend of Mrs. Lily James. Like to talk to you about her debt, if I might. Not much to talk about, young man, Tyler said. Mrs. James owes my client, Mr. Littleton, $2,000. Due next week it is. Well, I was wondering if I could pay her debt and get some kind of receipt saying she paid in full. Tyler sat up straighter in his chair. As long as it's paid, I can give you a receipt and a letter saying the debt has been paid. That'd make sure her ranch was free and clear again? I asked. Tyler nodded. I sat the saddlebags on a chair and reached inside. Taking a leather pouch out, I counted $2,000 in banknotes and double eagle gold coins. Sure makes my saddlebags a lot lighter, I said, smiling. Tyler had a strange look on his face. I think it was greed and pleasure looking at all those double eagles. Could I have that receipt and letter now, Mr. Tyler? He shook himself. Of course, young man. He wrote a receipt for the $2,000 and a letter stating Miss Lily's debt had been paid in full. Thank you, sir. I'll see that Mrs. James gets this right away. I left his office and rode over to Miss Lily's shop. Here you are, Miss Lily, I said, handing her the receipt and the letter. Your debt's been paid in full and your ranch is safe. She thanked me and asked me to stay for a few days. I claimed I needed to get on the trail and left her. I made camp outside of town, changed into dark clothes, and rode back to town in the late afternoon. Sitting on my horse near the bank, I waited until it closed. After everyone had left, I quietly climbed the stairs to Tyler's office again. Just before I stepped inside, I tied a bandana over the lower part of my face. It wasn't much of a disguise, but I was hoping Tyler would pay more attention to my .44 pointed at his head than he did to me. Tyler was still behind his desk. He looked up and stared at the barrel of my pistol. I walked over to the floor safe by his desk. "Open the safe," I ordered, deepening my voice. He stood, worked the combination, and pulled the small door out of the way. "Put the money on the desk." Tyler dug into the safe and piled several $1,000s on the desk. "Whose money is it, and how much is there?" "10,000, Tyler replied. "All but $200 belongs to Royce Littleton. Count out 5,000 and hand it to me." He handed me the money and sat back down. "Tell you what, Tyler, you tell Littleton you was robbed." "I'll take this," I said, holding up half the money. "And you keep the other half for yourself?" As I talked, I tied Tyler's hands behind him and tied him to his chair. "Give me 4 or 5 hours before you report the robbery and keep 5,000 for yourself. No one will know except me, and I'll be long gone. If you report it sooner and I get caught, so will you?" He nodded. I stepped closer and hit him with my fist over his eye. He yelped in pain. "That'll leave quite a mark and make it look like you put up a fight," I told him. "Be smart and keep the money, Mr. Tyler." I left a lot more quickly than I'd come. Riding out to my camp, I picked up my pack horse and rode southeast toward San Antonio. I learned later that Miss Lily had the deed redone, giving me half interest in the ranch, Clint said to Sam with a big grin. "Once I got settled, she sent me my share of the profits every year. After she died, I sold the place to a youngster from back east who wanted to be a real Wild West rancher." The old man looked inside himself for a minute and then smiled. "Miss Lily was quite a woman, she was." Sam laughed until he had tears in his eyes. "You were a desperado, weren't you, Clint?" "A desperado? Don't know about that. I never took nothing from nobody who didn't deserve it. I never shot nobody who didn't have it coming." Clint smiled and said, "The law might not have seen it that way, though." He was quiet, remembering back to what Sam called his desperado days. "How long were you in San Antonio?" Sam asked, hoping to keep the older man talking. "Took me a while to get there. I made a few stops along the way," Clint said. "Helped some cattlemen in Fort Stockton chase down some rustlers and stayed on for a spell." "Chase down some rustlers? I thought you didn't like cattlemen." "Particular cattlemen, I don't. These weren't none of them." Clint grinned and shrugged his shoulders. "Anyways, the pay was real good." "You caught the rustlers for money? You were a bounty hunter like Tom Horn up in Wyoming," Sam said, surprised at Clint's actions. "Not like Horn. I never killed no one. Just brought them or the cattle back." Clint paused for several seconds and quietly added, "Course the cattleman hung him when I brought him back." "How long a spell?" "Huh. How long were you at Fort Stockton?" "A year, maybe a little longer. Then I stopped for several days in Sonora, exploring those caves and caverns near town. All in all, I guess it took me about a year and a half to make it to San Antonio," Clint explained. "You sure didn't keep any kind of schedule, did you?" Sam asked with a grin. "No need. Didn't have any place I had to be. But I rode into trouble in San Antonio. I just didn't know it for a few days." "What kind of trouble?" "I got a room at a boarding house. I'd spent a lot of time tracking rustlers and such, and figured I deserved to pamper myself a little. You know my old standbys, a soft bed, good meals, and a couple of visits to a saloon. Was the third night at the saloon that trouble jumped up. Knocking back my first whiskey of the evening, I looked around the saloon. Sitting at a poker table was a man I never thought I'd see again. It had been 4 or 5 years since I'd last laid eyes on him, but Marshall Harland from Pleasant Valley was sitting in on the game. Turning my back to the Marshal, I thought, maybe I'll leave San Antonio sooner than I'd planned. Didn't know the situation back in Pleasant Valley, but I did know that the Marshal and his deputies had been looking for me back there. I didn't want him to find me here. If he tried to take me back or arrest me, I'd have to kill him. I wasn't going back to Arizona so the cattlemen or the sheep men could hang me on some trumped-up charge. I walked to the swinging doors to leave when I heard a loud voice say, "Clint Lowell, there's a reward poster out on you." Slowly I turned. Harland was standing with his hand on his gun, but, "Hello, Marshal Harland," I said. "What are y'all doing in Texas?" "Ain't a marshal no more, but it's still Mr. Harland to you, boy. How can you arrest me if you're not the law?" "Maybe I ain't the law, but I can still collect the reward for bringing you in. Drop your gun, boy, and put up your hands," Harland ordered. Another man at the table stood to back Harland's play. "Don't reckon I will, Harland. I'm not gonna let you take me back." I stared at him and the other man for a few seconds. Harland started to pull his pistol, and his partner reached for his own weapon at the same time. Jolly had taught me well. Before he could clear leather, I shot Harland in the chest and quickly put a round into his partner. Both men fell to the floor. Not seeing any others with Harland, I turned and walked out of the saloon. Reckon my stay in San Antonio is about over. I went to the boarding house, got my gear, went to the stable to get my horses, and rode out of town at a fast lope. Maybe the witnesses in the saloon would say Harland drew first, and maybe they wouldn't. Either way, the fact that I was a wanted man with a price on my head didn't make me feel real easy staying in San Antonio. Late afternoon of the second day I rode into New Braunfels. It was a farming and ranching area with a lot of German settlers. Maybe I should just hunker down for a spell, I thought. I'd been there for 10 days or so when the bartender at my favorite saloon, it was the only saloon in town, asked what I worked at. Looks like I need to get a job to keep people from wondering who I was, I thought. Looking for work, I told him. My stake has about run out and I've laid around long enough. Got any idea who might need some help? I can run cattle or horses, know a bit about ranching, and can even mend fences. My stake was in real good shape, but I thought it never hurt to work when I could. Who knows when the money would run out? Most of the ranches around here are full up far as I know, he replied. He looked thoughtful as he poured another drink. Reckon you could talk to Mrs. Conroy out to the Circle C. Here she needs some help with her place. Problem is she can't pay a full wage, so most don't want to work for her. Well, I don't need much. Just a place to sleep, a meal or two, and enough to buy a drink on payday. Where can I find Mrs. Conroy? Take the north road out of town. About 10 miles you'll come to a big rock butte. Take the trail to the left, and the Circle C is another 2 or 3 miles. He looked at me and added, she's a widow woman, and from what I hear, she's a mite skittish. Took a shot at the last man who rode in unannounced, so make sure you let her know you're coming in. I checked out of the boarding house the next morning. Even if I didn't sign on with Mrs. Conroy, I was gonna move on. Too many questions had started to be asked around town about the stranger who didn't have to work. About half an hour after I passed the rock butte, I crested a rise. Down in a small valley, in a clearing, I could see a ranch house, barn, and corrals. Must be the Conroy place, I thought. Following the wagon trail toward the house, I stopped at the edge of the clearing. Hello, the house, I shouted, minding what the bartender had said. I didn't want to get shot. The front door to the house opened and a young woman stepped out onto the porch. She carried what looked like a Winchester. Who are you and what do you want? The woman asked. Name's Clint Lowell, ma'am. Looking for work, but if you don't need a hired hand, I'd like to water my horses before I ride on. Come ahead slow and keep your hands where I can see them, she ordered. I rode toward the house at a walk, keeping both of my hands on the saddle horn. The bartender said Mrs. Conroy was a widow, so I didn't expect the young woman standing on the porch. She looked to be no more than 18 or so. She reminded me of Molly, the young working girl from Miss Lorena's who I'd been about half in love with. Mrs. Conroy had the same reddish blonde hair with freckles across her nose. She was taller than Molly and had blue eyes. Clint Lowell, Mrs. Conroy, I said. Folks in town said you might need a hired hand. Get down and water your horses. We'll talk a bit, she suggested, as I led my horses to a watering trough. Mrs. Conroy brought a bucket pulled fresh from the well and dipper so I could drink too. What kind of work can you do, Mr. Lowell? She asked. I can work cattle, mend fences, train horses, or just about anything else needed on a ranch. Where are you from? Where do you call home? Well, I don't rightly have a home anymore, Mrs. Conroy. Guess you could say where I throw down my bedroll is my home. She raised an eyebrow at me. I don't know why her unasked question bothered me, but I continued. My stepfather was killed and I had to leave our ranch before the same thing happened to me. Been drifting for several years now. Where was your ranch? Arizona, Pleasant Valley to be exact. I've heard and read about the Pleasant Valley War, she commented. Which side were you on? We was sorta caught in the middle, I replied. Our ranch had a real good water hole, and neither side wanted the other to use it. So both sides decided they'd take our ranch to keep it from the others. I stopped and stared off at the rolling hills for a bit. Didn't matter about Jolly, my stepfather, or me. They wanted the water hole. I left before I had to kill a bunch of them, and before they could kill me. Back in '86 it was. That answer your questions, ma'am? I'm sorry, Mr. Lowell. I didn't mean to bring up memories of a bad time. Mrs. Conroy looked me over for several seconds. I guess my story of losing my stepfather and my ranch put her at ease a little. Tell you what, stay for supper. We'll talk about a job afterwards. I hesitated and she added, if nothing else, you'll get a good meal out of it. During supper, I found out that Mrs. Conroy's given name was Eleanor, but most everyone called her Ellie. She stated in a sort of matter-of-fact way that she was a widow. How'd you lose your husband, Mrs. Conroy, if it don't hurt you to talk about? I asked. Jed was on a scouting trip looking for strays on the far side of the ranch. He must have gotten hold of some bad water or food because by the time he got back to the house he had cholera. I tried to get him to let me go for the doctor, but we waited too long. He died about 3 days after he returned home. Ellie paused for a few seconds and added, "He's buried on top of that hill yonder. It was his favorite place on the ranch." "Sorry, ma'am. Now it's me, didn't mean to bring up bad memories," I replied. "You didn't, Mr. Lowell. I married Jed in an arranged marriage, arranged by my parents before they left for California. That was 2 years ago. Jed was about 10 years older than me, but he was a good man and I liked him. Suppose I would have learned to love him as time went on." Mrs. Conroy gave me a little smile. Like I said, he was a good man, but really didn't have a lick of sense. I told him to take more water with him, but he didn't want to listen to a woman. "Guess he should have." "Yes, I reckon he should have," I said. "Where have you been since you left Arizona, Mr. Lowell?" "Been mostly drifting. Lived in Deming, New Mexico for a few years, but my employer passed away and the new owner shut down the business. That put me back on the trail again. Worked out of Fort Stockton for a spell, then headed this way." I stopped and grinned at her. "Reckon you've got my whole history now, Mrs. Conroy." "Sorry to pry, but I like to know about the people who are working for me," she said. "If you want to work, I'll give you a chance. Pays $30 a month and found. No, it's not full wages for a hand, but it's all I can do right now. I'll provide meals, and you can sleep in the room in the barn." It was Jed's refuge when he and I fussed a bit, and it's set up very comfortably. If you're still here come winter, you can use one of the bedrooms up to the house. If we get more than 50 cattle to market, I'll pay you a bonus. "Thanks, Mrs. Conroy. I'd be right proud to work for you. I'll start in the morning." "You'll start right now, Mr. Lowell, if you please," Mrs. Conroy said. "There's firewood to be split, the top rail on the corral needs to be fastened down, and the gate needs work too." She looked at Clint to see how he took her orders. "The plenty of light to work by yet." Clint smiled, tipped his hat, and replied, "Yes, Em." He led his horses to the corral, unsaddled them, and put them inside. Going into the barn, he got some tools and started working on the corral gate. About an hour later, Mrs. Conroy called to him to come have some coffee before bedtime. For the next 2 months, Clint did the normal chores around a ranch. He also moved the cattle to different grazing areas. It took him 2 days to ride the complete circuit of the ranch boundaries. During this time, he learned the lay of the land, where the good water holes were, and what areas to avoid. There was one spot that was like a bog, and several times he had to pull cattle out of it. That was a hard, nasty job, and he usually ended up very tired and very muddy. After saving the 3rd steer in 4 days from the bog, Clint said, "Mrs. Conroy, if it's all the same to you, the next animal that gets itself stuck in the bog, I'm gonna shoot. You can deduct its value from my pay." He was laughing and kidding. Mrs. Conroy looked at the sorry sight in front of her and laughed too. Clint was covered from his hat to his boots in the red clay mud from the bog. His horse was also mud-covered and looked as tired as his owner. "Mr. Lowell, we'll never build the herd if you run around shooting the animals that offend you," she replied with a big grin. "Yes, but I can surely think about it." Clint found himself admiring Mrs. Conroy. His respect for her grew every day. Little girl was dealt a bad hand, he thought, but she don't wring her hands and complain. She just works and tries to make a life for herself. She may be young, but she's all woman. But it was more than respect. Clint found himself thinking of staying put and giving up drifting. For her part, Mrs. Conroy had developed a respect for the young man who worked for her. He's never said or done anything objectionable, she thought. There were men who would have tried to take advantage of a woman alone. Clint isn't one of them. She'd been alone for a long time and began to think of what it would be like if Clint decided to stay. She was in the barn, repairing a bridle late one afternoon when Clint came back to the house. He'd obviously been wrestling another steer out of the bog. Both he and his horse were covered in mud. Clint rode his horse to the watering trough and washed the animal down. "There, that'll make you feel better," Clint said to his horse. He looked at the house, then around the barn area, and stripped down to his birthday suit and washed himself. Finishing his bath, he started toward his room in the barn, carrying his dirty clothes. Mrs. Conroy hadn't meant to watch, but Clint's lean, hard body drew her attention. As he started toward the barn, she quickly returned to the house. She didn't want Clint to know she'd seen him washing. Clint was saddling his horse the next morning before breakfast. Mrs. Conroy came out to join him. "Where you headed so early, Mr. Lowell?" "Thought I'd go up to Huaco Springs. There should be more cattle up there. I must have missed some strays last week. You know, I think my herd is getting smaller instead of growing, and it seems like it's always up by the spring that they disappear," Mrs. Conroy said. "Think I'll ride with you. Saddle my horse, please, while I change clothes." She hurried back to the house, not giving him time to object. Clint looked up as Mrs. Conroy came back a few minutes later carrying her Winchester and wearing men's breeches. Now that's something you don't see every day, he said to himself. I knew she was a nice-looking woman, but I sure didn't know she was so well put together. With her face and build, she would have been one of the favorites at Miss Lorena's. Where's my horse, Mr. Lowell? Ma'am, it might not be a good idea for you to go with me, he replied. If you're missing cattle like you say, we might run into some rustlers, or a cougar or a bear, or just about anything. All the more reason for me to go. If it's rustlers, I'll be able to claim my property. Now get my horse, Mr. Lowell. She don't leave much room for disagreeing, do she? He asked himself. He went into the barn, saddled her horse, and led it out to her. He saw Mrs. Conroy put her Winchester in the saddle scabbard before she mounted. Noticing Clint watching her, she touched the stock of the rifle. Cougar, bear, or rustlers, my Winchester can handle any of them, she said with a small grin. Let's go, Mr. Lowell. We're wasting daylight. Yes, Em. Clint followed Mrs. Conroy on the trail leading to Huaco Springs. Riding at a slow lope, it took them almost an hour to get close to the spring. About 2 miles from the spring, Clint took the lead. She started to object, but he stopped her. I reckon I got a bit more experience than you do, ma'am. Best let me go first. As they got closer to the spring, Clint saw horse tracks left in the soft ground. Dismounting, he knelt and examined them. Looks to be 3, maybe 4 riders, not more than an hour old, he explained. Pointing, he added, they went off that-a-way, driving 10 head or so. Looking around, he spotted more sign. Cougar tracks too, a big one. Reckon we got 2 kinds of trouble. Clint mounted and followed the horse trail with Mrs. Conroy tagging along behind him. She'd noticed a change come over him when he found the horse tracks. He's changed from the polite and sometimes teasing young cowhand into a man with a cold, hard look, she thought. They had just passed the spring when a loud scream from a hunting cougar spooked their horses. Clint brought his mount under control, but Mrs. Conroy's horse went crazy. The horse neighed in fear and reared up, throwing Mrs. Conroy over its rump to fall heavily to the ground. She lay there and didn't move. Clint pulled his nervous horse to a halt and hit the ground before the animal came to a complete stop. He rushed over to her, knelt down and lifted her head onto his lap. Ellie, Ellie, come on back, he almost pleaded. Clint was scared to death that Ellie was hurt bad. He ran his hands over her legs, arms, and the back of her neck, checking for breaks. He realized now how much she'd come to mean to him. Ellie, Ellie, he repeated several times as he held her. Ellie came to and heard Clint calling her. She looked into his eyes and saw the concern and something more. Was that love she saw? She put her hand up and touched Clint's cheek. I'm okay, Clint. He put his arm around her and helped her stand. Sorry, Mrs. Conroy. Didn't mean to overstep my bounds, ma'am, he said as he stepped away from her. Ellie smiled at Clint, stepped closer to him, and took his hand. You didn't, Clint. She put her arms around his waist and put her head on his chest. Well, I'll be, he thought as he hugged her back. Sure didn't see that coming, but it sure is a fine thing. The cougar screamed again and Ellie's horse bolted for home, leaving her afoot. Clint's horse was standing where his reins had been dropped. The horse was trained to ground tie, and short of being attacked by the cougar, he wouldn't move more than 2 or 3 feet away. Clint pulled his Winchester, levered a shell into the breech, and faced the direction of the hunting cougar. There he is, Ellie said, pointing to an overhanging tree limb. Shoot him, Clint. Clint lowered his rifle and shook his head. Ellie looked at him, surprised that he didn't shoot. Aren't you going to kill him? No need. It's a she-cat, and she wasn't after our horses. Clint watched as the cougar climbed out of the tree and ran off into the woods. Probably got a cub or 2 back in the hills somewheres. But she'll kill some of our cattle, Ellie objected. Don't think so. Cattle are a mite big for a cougar to take on. They might get a calf or 2, but they only kill for food, and y'all can stand losing a calf once in a while. Clint chuckled. Besides, I sorta admire them, and you can't blame a cougar for being a cougar. Clint mounted and offered his arm to help Ellie climb up behind him. Bet we don't catch your horse until we get back to the barn, he said. That animal sure was spooked. He took it slow, returning to the ranch house. Riding double wasn't the most comfortable way to travel. Clint immediately took notice of Ellie's arms reaching around him. Every time the horse hit a rough spot, she would hug him tighter. I could get used to this, he thought, but she don't need a man with a price on his head. Best I remember that I'll be move-in on one of these days. 2 hours later, they rode into the ranch yard and saw Ellie's horse was standing by the corral. Decided to come back home, did you? She asked. She was upset that her horse had thrown her and ran away. Who do you think those tracks belong to? Ellie asked as she put her prodigal son of a horse in the corral. Don't rightly know just yet, but I reckon they're the reason we're missing cattle. Clint thought for a minute. Think I'll head back up there and see if I can follow them. The tracks were fresh and driving cattle, they can't be too far ahead. Let me saddle another horse and I'll come with you, Ellie offered. Clint slowly shook his head. No ma'am, you won't. Before she could object, he continued, it could get right nasty if I catch up with them. Ellie got a stubborn look on her face. Ellie, this is what I do. I can't do my job and watch after you too. Please stay here. Ellie stared at him for almost a minute while he waited for her to agree to stay at the ranch. You're planning on coming back, aren't you, Clint? I mean, you told me after your last job at Fort Stockton you recovered the cattle, drove them back to your employer's ranch, and rode off. You didn't even get paid, you just rode off. I wouldn't like that much. No, Ellie, you ain't shook of me just yet, Clint replied with a grin. I'll be back with or without the cattle. He watched her answering smile and said, reckon I better get some trail supplies and head back to the springs. Ellie helped him put the supplies in his saddlebags, and as he started to mount said, you come back, Clint Lowell. He hesitated, then Ellie stepped closer and hugged him. Remember you promised. He smiled down at her and answered, yes, Em. Clint mounted his horse, tipped his hat to Ellie, and rode back toward Huaco Springs. I'll bring her cattle back or the men that took them, he said to himself, even if I have to bring the men back tied over their saddles. Instead of riding directly back to the spring, Clint put his horse into a lope and rode at an angle in the direction the tracks had been leading. After 2 hours, he cut the trail about 2 miles northeast of the spring and slowed to a walk. The tracks were easy to see, so he kicked his horse back into a lope and followed. It was coming on to dusk when he heard the cattle and saw a campfire through the trees. Clint slowed his horse, then got off and walked closer. Sitting around the campfire were 3 men. They looked like wanderers, dirty with worn-out clothes. Their horses weren't much better. The big man looked to be about 40 and the other 2 a little younger. It was hard to tell with their dirty faces. Clint got close enough to hear the men talking. Reckon we'll join up with the others tomorrow evening, the largest of the men said. Figure we can cull another 20 head or so from the Conroy woman, another offered. Not if she drives her cattle down closer to the house, the last man cautioned. Even if she does, she can't stop us, the large man replied. She don't got no help. That's where you're wrong, mister, Clint said as he stepped into the campsite. Mrs. Conroy ain't alone anymore. She's got me for help. The 3 men were startled and stood to face Clint. After several seconds, the large man spoke. Don't figure one man can stop us. Why don't you ride on, son? You don't want no part of this. Can't rightly do that, Clint replied. Mrs. Conroy hired me to help with her cattle. What kind of help would I be if I let y'all run off a bunch of them? He looked at the big man's 2 companions as they started to step farther away and spread out. Don't take another step, you two. Stay where I can see you. The big man sighed, stared at Clint and asked, what's your name, son? The reason I want to know is I don't like killing a man without knowing his name. Clint stared right back at him with fire in his eyes, but he didn't lose sight of the other 2. That's brave talk for a man that's about to die, he responded. Drop your guns or use them. Makes no never mind to me, but I'm getting bored just jawing with you. The big man reached for his pistol, followed by the other 2. There were several gunshots, and a cloud of gun smoke drifted over the campsite. When the shots stopped, the 3 rustlers were on the ground. Clint walked over and kicked their guns away from them. Only then did he look at his side and his bloody shirt. He lifted the shirt to examine the wound. There was a crease running along his left side about an inch or so deep. Blood was oozing slowly out of the area. Reckon one of them got a mite lucky, he thought. Clint went to his saddle and got his canteen. He washed the wound and used part of his shirt tail to make a bandage. That'll have to do for now, he said to himself. Clint knew his side would stiffen up and make riding painful. Better get these cattle headed back to the ranch while I still can ride. He walked to his horse and mounted. Looking back at the 3 dead men, he said out loud, y'all don't deserve to be buried. Reckon varmints got to eat too. Clint turned his horse, gathered the 10 head of cattle, and started to drive them back toward the ranch house. The sun beginning to set, he thought. Better push these cattle a little harder. Clint was about halfway back when he saw Ellie riding toward him. Dang woman didn't listen to me, he thought. She rode around the cattle and joined him riding drag. I told you to stay at the ranch, Clint said. You work for me, Mr. Lowell, so I don't take your orders, Ellie replied with a grin. Then seeing his bloody shirt, she said, oh my God, you're hurt. How bad is it? Get down and let me look. Ellie, if I get off this horse, I may not get back on until tomorrow or the next day. Let's get back to the ranch, and then you can tend to me. It was almost full dark when they drove the cattle to join the rest of the herd in the pasture close to the house. Clint's was still oozing blood, and he was getting weak. He almost fell off his horse when he and Ellie got back to the house. She helped him inside into one of the bedrooms and tended to his wound. As she worked over him, Clint told her about the run-in with the 3 rustlers. Ellie worried about her cowboy until his fever broke, and sometime after 10, she fell asleep in a chair next to Clint's bed. In the morning, after making sure Clint was okay, Ellie said, "I'm going to town to get the marshal." He gave her a questioning look and she explained, "We need to report those rustlers and let him know where he can find them." "I ain't had much luck with lawmen," Clint replied. "Not sure it's the best thing to do." "We've done nothing but protect what's ours," Ellie added. "Besides, the word will get around that you'll pay a high price for stealing cattle from the Circle C." She leaned over and quickly kissed him. "It's all right. I'll be back in a few hours. You stay in bed until I get back, you hear?" It was nearly 6 hours later when Ellie rode up to the corral at a high gallop. Clint was sitting in a rocking chair on the front porch. "Her horse looks about done in," he thought. "Marshal Todd will be along in a bit," Ellie told him. She came over and made him lift his shirt so she could look at his wound. "Thought I told you to stay in bed." "Yes'm, you did, but I got tired of laying there like a pole-axe steer and decided a little fresh air would do me good." The marshal rode up to the ranch house about an hour later. He was leading 3 horses with men draped across the saddles. He stopped in front of the Ellie and Clint on the porch. "Marshal, this is Clint Lowell," Ellie said. "Howdy, Mr. Lowell," Marshal Todd said, not dismounting. "Hear you had a run-in with the Jones boys," he added, pointing over his shoulder with his thumb. "Don't know their names, Marshal, but I stopped 3 cattle thieves," Clint replied. "I gave them the chance to drop their guns and come back with me." He looked Marshal Todd square in the eye and told him about his run-in with the 3 rustlers. "They didn't want to come." "How's your wound, Mr. Lowell?" the marshal asked. "Might stiff right now, but I'll be okay in a few days." Clint fingered the bandage on his side and asked, "There gonna be trouble about me killing those 3? He paused and added, "They didn't give me much choice, Marshal. They pulled down on me and I fought back." From the way it looked out, there appears to have happened just as you said. Besides, the Jones brothers are well-known cattle and horse thieves. But there aren't any warrants out on them, so I couldn't arrest them. Marshal Todd smiled. "Won't be no trouble with the law. Y'all might have to tell your story to the circuit judge when he comes through, but I doubt it. Fact is, you probably did the ranchers around here a favor." Marshal Todd looked around at the ranch for several seconds. Then, almost as if he were talking to himself, he said, "There was a wanted poster on a man named Lowell from over to Arizona a few years back. Talk about a shootout in San Antonio too." He turned and looked directly at Clint. "Of course that warrant from Arizona don't matter here in Texas, and from what I heard, this Lowell feller was just defending himself in San Antonio." The marshal nodded to Clint and tipped his hat to Ellie. "Ma'am," he said, then added, "I'll let you know if you need to talk to the judge, Mr. Lowell." He turned his horse and began the long ride back to town. "I reckon I'm healed up good enough to ride," Clint thought 2 weeks later. "Time I was moving on." He hesitated for a minute, then said aloud to his horse, "Every place I go seems I shoot someone or get shot at. That's no life for Ellie. She needs a man that don't have no warrants or paper out on him. If I stay, someday somebody from Arizona or Deming, New Mexico will come looking for me." Clint chuckled a little and added, "Hell, that don't even count Pecos, Fort Stockton, Odessa, and San Antonio. Thought I was getting away from trouble when I came to Texas. Guess I'll tell Ellie I'm leaving come morning," he added silently to himself. After supper that evening, Clint looked at Ellie as she poured the after-supper coffee. "Ellie, I'm gonna be leaving in the morning." Ellie was shocked. "I thought you liked it here, Clint." "I thought you liked me." "I do, but I need to move on." Before she could say anything, he continued, "You need a man that don't have a past coming after him. You need a man that can think of nothing but being with you." "Ellie, I ain't that man. I've done some bad things in my life and couldn't make you pay for them." Clint took Ellie's hand. "I care about you too much to have that happen to you. I'll be leaving in the morning." Ellie put her head down for a few seconds. Looking up at Clint, she said, "It's time for you to make a stand, Clint. You've been drifting for a long time. I don't know what you're afraid of, but it's time to stop riding fences." She stopped to wipe a tear from her eye. "I have feelings for you, Clint, but you won't let me get close to you. Time for you to let someone love you, and you love them back. If your past comes after, you will stand up to it together. Stay with me, Clint. We can make a good life for ourselves." He stared at her for a bit. "Ellie, I can't. I'd never forgive myself if something happened to you because of the things I've done in my life. I'll be leaving at first light." The next morning, Clint put the pack saddle on one horse and saddled his mount. He stepped up onto his horse and looked at the house. Ellie didn't come out to say goodbye. Can't blame her, he thought. Clint turned his horse and rode out of the valley. Sam was quiet as Clint finished his story. "Don't mean any disrespect, sir. I mean Clint, but how could you ride off and leave Ellie? You said yourself you cared for her. You said she needed help, and you said she loved you. How could you ride out?" "Well, son, you see Look there," Clint said, pointing to a car pulling up to the house. "There comes the family. Reckon you'll get to meet the woman that finally roped and hog-tied me." The big sedan stopped in front of the ranch house. An elderly, silver-haired woman got out of the passenger side. Even Sam could see the beauty she had been in her youth. Must be about 70, he thought. A tall, whipcord thin man got out of the driver's side. If that's not Clint's son, I'll be surprised, Sam thought. He looks like Clint must have 30 years ago. The man had the same gray streaked brown hair that Clint showed and wore the same walrus-type mustache. A younger version of the older woman got out of the rear door of the car. Her mane of reddish blonde hair had a few gray ones in it, and she wore it unfashionably long. It hung down her back almost to her waist. As the three stepped onto the porch, the older woman asked, "What kind of trouble have you gotten into now, old man?" She smiled at Sam and beamed at her husband. "I'm as innocent as a newborn babe, honey," Clint answered with his own smile. Turning to Sam, he said, "This is my wife, Sam, Ellie Conroy Lowell." He chuckled at the look on Sam's face. "Ellie, this is Sam Rayburn. He works for that National Geographic magazine, and they're doing a story about me." "You said you rode off Clint," Sam accused. He faced Mrs. Lowell and said, "Excuse my manners. I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Lowell." Ellie extended her hand to Sam. "You're writing a story about my husband? What could be so interesting about this old scoundrel?" "Well, ma'am, I'm doing a story about the Pleasant Valley Range War, and Mr. Lowell is the last living person who was involved." Sam grinned and added, "But he's had an adventurous life." "I'm sure he told you all about it too," Ellie replied, laughing. She stepped over to Clint, leaned down and kissed him. Clint reached out and patted her on the behind. "Time for supper, woman." "I'm hungry," he said. "Yes, sir," Ellie said. "Introduce our guest to our children. You will be staying for supper, won't you, Mr. Rayburn?" "Thank you, ma'am, but I have to get back to my hotel room. I've got a lot of writing to do before I head back to LA. And I need to call my editor and tell him the story has grown some." "Well, let me introduce you to our children before you leave." Ellie smiled and said, "They're part of Clint's story too. I'm Jared Lowell. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Rayburn." He stepped forward and shook hands with Sam. "This is my sister, Lorena." Sam turned to look in disbelief at Clint and heard him chuckle. "Yes, sir, I did," Clint said. "It wasn't until 2 years after Lorena was born that Clint told me why he wanted to give her that name," Ellie said with a grin. "To be honest, I thought it was a fine way to honor a woman that had helped my husband when he was very young and very alone." Sam laughed. "Thank you, Clint, for your time and patience. It was a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Lowell, and you too, Jared and Lorena." He walked to his car, waved, and drove back to New Braunfels. Got a lot of work to do on this story, he thought. Might just have to expand the story past the Pleasant Valley War. "Nice young feller," Clint said, "but he can't drink worth a damn." He reached for the bottle of Jack Daniels, but Ellie took it from him. She looked at the nearly empty bottle, smiled, and took it inside. "I think you've had enough for today," she said, and kissed him again. "Dang woman. Takes all the fun out of a good day," Clint complained. But his eyes were full of love as he watched his wife go into the house. His children laughed at their parents and went inside to supper. 3 months later, Sam was once again at the Lowell Ranch. As he stopped his car in front of the house, Ellie came out to greet him. "Howdy, Mrs. Lowell. Don't know if you remember me. I'm Sam Rayburn." "I remember, Sam. It's nice to see you again," Ellie said. "What brings you back to the Circle C?" Sam smiled and answered, "I convinced my editor to do a story about Clint's life after his involvement in the Pleasant Valley War." Holding up a manuscript, Sam said, "This is a first draft of the story and a book I'm writing. Thought Clint might go over it with me." Ellie sadly smiled. "You didn't hear, did you?" Before Sam could answer, she continued, "Clint passed away last month." Sam was surprised to hear that Clint, who he thought of as indestructible, had died. "What happened, Mrs. Lowell?" "Please call me Ellie. I think Clint would have liked that." "To answer your question, nothing really happened except old age. He was fine that evening when we went to bed. Just before I drifted off to sleep, Clint leaned over, kissed me, and said, 'Thanks for saving me, Ellie girl.' She used a handkerchief to dry her eyes. I got up the next morning and fixed coffee. When he didn't come out of the bedroom, I went in to wake him." Ellie sighed. He looked peaceful with a smile on his face, like he was having a nice dream, but he was gone. "I'm so sorry, Ellie," Sam responded. "I sure did enjoy talking with Clint." After a few seconds, Sam gave a little laugh and said, "He sure was an interesting man with an interesting life. I envy him." Ellie nodded and smiled at the young man. Reckon interesting is a good description of Clint Lowell. Sam handed Ellie the manuscript. If you would, when you find time, maybe you'd like to read this over. If you like the story, I'd be proud to see that it gets published. Ellie nodded and took the book. What's the title? She asked. Desperado, Sam answered. She smiled and said, Clint certainly was that. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.